Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to XPC Talks. And we're very excited to have Caleb with us today. And we've been bantering about humanity and technology for quite some time. So this naturally surfaced for us to do a deeper dive on the topic. And Caleb, I'm excited to hand this over to you. Tell us a bit about yourself and then, what we'll be chatting about.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks, Paulus, for suggesting this as a topic. As you mentioned, we've shared some notes and some thoughts, and I've had a number of conversations, probably more so than I ever had in the last year on this topic. And so we just thought it would be good to raise the subject and share some things that we've learned and invite discussion around it. I think there's far more questions than there are answers at this point, and I am no expert on the subject, but I have some questions and things that have stood out to me, and so I'd love to just share them and invite perspective. So I'll just give a quick rundown of agenda, and then I'll give a brief sort of background of myself and what sort of has brought me to this table. But for the sake of how we can spend the time, the goal, I think, today is just to think together. I think it's so often we just get hit with so many things and we have little time to process them. So hopefully we can do some of the slow thinking today together and raise some questions to wrestle with, maybe a perspective that you spend the rest of the day or maybe not thinking about. And hopefully it's just fun discussion. There's a lot of things happening in AI, and so this will just be a place to think about how that affects human values. And so for how we'll spend the time, I'm thinking about three sort of big parts of this. I'll intro myself. I think people are probably driving, so I think it probably makes sense to not necessarily do an intro of everyone in the group unless you think otherwise.
I think we can keep rolling with what you've done. Yeah.
Okay. But three parts. I think I'll share observations. I've put together some slides that just kind of highlight things that I found most interesting and notable from resources I've engaged with. As Polly has mentioned, if you've got questions, throw them in the chat. We can pause and we can invite them as they go. But I will try to have some time for discussion if you've got something on the brain and you want to challenge an idea, probe something further. We'll save some time for a little bit of discussion. And then if we have time, I'd love to do a case study where we get to ask some questions about an example technology and work through thinking about values there. And so that'll be a group exercise we can do. So that's sort of the setup and the flow. Anything else to add to that, Polly? So that sounds good.
I think it sounds great. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll share a little bit about my background and just what sort of shapes my thinking as it relates to this topic. There's a lot to my background, but I think these are a few things that are of note. I spent a good amount of time overseas. I grew up in the Philippines. I spent 18 years there. I've lived in a number of different countries, and I just think that has done a lot to shape my worldview of how I see different societies and cultures and places. I've spent about a decade doing direct patient care. I worked for 5 years as a paramedic and another 5 as a pediatric oncology RN in patients. And so I've seen a lot of the patient care side of things. And then I've spent the last 5 years building healthcare tech products, mostly for care coordination. I work right now at Oscar Health Insurance, and I've worked at Memorial Health, and a lot of these things I work on are around care coordination type of tools. So I've spent a good amount so I didn't get my animations to go with this. This is the most animations you'll see in this talk. So that's a little bit about me. And then I think there's a bunch of things that influence how I think. Paulus and I mentioned some of these podcasts. The Glass Cage is a really good one. There's a TED Talk on the downfall of thinking I really recommend. I think a lot of this human values has to do with beliefs. So my worldview is a Christian worldview, and so I bring a lot of what I think about human values and things like that from that perspective, and then just many discussions and conversations on the topic. My brother works for OpenAI, so I've talked with many optimists and pessimists about the subject, and so I share different conversations from different spheres, and so those are some of the things I'll bring to the table. And then for the topics, I've got about 6 or 7 different slides that touch on different topics. Some of them are related, some of them aren't, but we'll just kind of jump through them and let's dive in. So some of you, there's a survey, I put this in here. Some of you filled out some information. What are you most worried about? To me, it looked like there were two categories. One was sort of like a trust safety, like kind of thinking through what happens if the technology doesn't work well, that if there's gaps and if it fails and that kind of things. And another half was around sort of quality, like what if it replaces human connection and isn't empathetic? I would say most of the things I have outlined today fall into the latter category, or I think there's lots and lots of people thinking about how it can go wrong, how the technology could fail in working, like what happens if we just have AI, diagnosing patients, and what if they miss a diagnosis? I think there's lots and lots of people thinking about that. I will challenge us to think more about, like, let's assume it works. What then? Like, do we want that? Like, if overnight this change and this new technology that could, you name it, do it, worked really, really well, but it replaced 100,000 jobs or skills or just changed the way the world existed, like, is that good? So we'll probably focus more on the second half category. I think the first topic or kind of concept that came to my mind when one of the podcasts raised was just the idea that human progress and technological progress are not the same, or that's the proposed idea that they shared, and I'm aligned that there are things that we can do that advance us technologically, but do they advance us as a human society? And so we can advance capabilities and efficiency, but what does that mean for, like, human flourishing? So I think there's questions about what separates the two, and what are we making sort of progress against? I think some example of this would be like technological progress that seems obviously aligned with human values, maybe something like vaccinations. We know that this can help people live longer, and that seems great. But maybe chemical weapons is an example where it's like, is that a good idea? We got new technology and new capabilities, but does that actually help human flourishing? There's a lot more vague examples in the AI space, but just to kind of lay the groundwork for what I mean by that. Trying to answer the question of what's the difference between the two and how do we measure it, I think raises the idea of, like, progress, and within progress is kind of this idea of, like, well, what do we value? I think that raises a question of, like, how do we define and measure value? Um, and so I think it's harder and harder to measure different categories of value. And I think there's some obvious, as I thought about this, there's some, like, obvious big categories of where these fit into. I think I bucket them in three. There's probably more, but for me, thinking about them in, like, narratives, so cost narrative, outcome narrative, and sort of a human narrative. Cost narrative is pretty easy to think through. I think most businesses and products and services operate around this. It's like the efficiency and the productivity. Like, can I do this faster and cheaper? Can I get more output with this tool or with this technology? And that's usually the tool that we measure. Like, is this a good idea? Is like, if I can do this faster and I can get more output, then it's good. That's like the narrative that we use to measure, is this good? The outcome narrative is probably also used pretty significantly, maybe to a lesser extent. So things like access, quality, and satisfaction. So if I develop some, I can have a virtual primary care visit. Now 50% more people can get access to a primary care in rural areas that they couldn't before. And so access has gone up. Or I come from the world of oncology. And so if a new treatment comes out, we have a 10% increase in survival rate. Like, these are the outcome narratives, or maybe it makes satisfaction for patients or clinicians better. I'd say we usually tie these still back to cost. Like, we still will probably think about access, and we will have to draw a line to like an ROI of some form. But these seem to be like the primary areas that, as a new technology or service comes in, we kind of measure against. And I think the third bucket is much less talked about and probably much, much harder to align on, which is the human narrative side of things. And I think, from my observations, it feels like human narratives is really, really shaped by our belief system about the world, whether that's faith or whether that's just other worldviews. And so, for example, as I mentioned, my worldview is shaped by Christian faith. And so some of the things that shapes for me is that I think humans were designed to interact with other humans. And I think that that's good for our flourishing. And so that shapes how I think about things. I think work is inherently good for us. And I think that there are my brother, for example, doesn't have a whole lot of value on human-to-human interaction, or thinks that like work going away is a good thing, that like these are problems to be solved. So I think your human narrative is a little bit of a gray area. Yeah, Paula.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yeah.
So you mentioned your brother works at OpenAI, and he seems to be kind of the opposite of your human value spectrum, even though you guys are from the same family, right? And do you feel that because he's contributing to this concept of taking work away from humanity, right? Because like there's definitely that narrative in like health tech that we can all just retire if robots do our thing. Do you know if like that is almost inherent in the culture of like a company like OpenAI? You have to embody that, or are there opposing views still contributing to like this intense technology that still want to enhance humanity, which is kind of the advertising narrative?
Yeah.
You know?
I don't actually know. Like, I'm sure that it's probably like you're not going to be punished for holding a different view, or that you can't. I would say that like we're probably mostly shaped by the waters that we swim in, so to speak. And so I think that like the impression that I've got is that like the waters that everybody's swimming in there is that like this is the direction to go and this is good. And I think you'd probably just have friction in that, like if most of the products and most of the things that you're working on are like working at like doing some job and then taking it and then replacing it, there's probably a narrative of like that is inherently good. And so the more that we can get AI to do these things and replace them, we don't really need to think about the downstream effects. Like doing those things and replacing them is inherently good. It leads towards this future where like we have got the technology to do all the real work, and now we can just go do our leisure things. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but I get what you're saying. It's like, yeah, is this a shared perspective? Does everyone think this? Does anyone think differently? Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I think those two ideas of like human progress, technological progress, and value are probably like the sort of big ideas that are of interest to me. And I think thinking through how do we define our human values, how do we measure them, where do they come up, are questions that I think are worth wrestling with. Yeah. Oops. Paul, did you have another question or?
No, keep going.
few other just kind of ideas that relate. There's an idea of enough, like what is enough. One of the podcasts talks about this idea of glut, and they frame it with when we solve a problem, sometimes we go beyond that and then it creates a new problem. And the two examples they gave was food, which is an interesting one. But they made the case that we've solved the food problem, that there was a point in the world where like there wasn't enough food for the people in the world. And now we have enough food. There's still a supply and like an access issue. There's still plenty of people who are without food, but like the quantity of food that we have is enough. And now we deal with things like obesity. And then maybe the more recent one is information, where there's plenty of history where access to information, books, printing press media, things like that, was not, many people did not have access. And now we have information too much. I mean, we're just all on our phones every day, videos, podcasts, news, and some of it's, a lot of it's not true, things like that, where, we're struggling with what's real, what's not, and then just sort of this mental indigestion. And so they just presented this idea of like, as we get technology that moves us forward towards solving a problem, how do we know when we've reached enough and we've solved that? How do we determine what's enough? And then how do we like preserve sort of that balance and say, this is pause. I'm aligned that there's a concept of enough. I think we see this show up in places of life, things like principle of generosity is based on having enough, and now I can give away. There's ideas of like Sabbath, like a day of rest, of pausing. I think we also see plenty of problems of having too much. And so I don't know how to define enough, and I don't know how to preserve the balance, but I am like, this seems like a concept. And as we develop technology, what are the guardrails by which we kind of say, have we solved this problem, and what happens if we keep going with it? This is another one that I found really interesting. This is in the glass cage talk. If anyone's heard of this sort of theory or myth, it's called the substitution myth. And so the idea of this is that we have this belief that we can introduce technology or automation, and we can change one part of a thing, and we can just make this one part of a thing better or faster, and that will just get easier and everything else will stay the same. And that's sort of the myth. And the reality is that changing a part of it will actually fundamentally change the entire activity. So for example, if I work as a nurse and I need to go into my patients' rooms and measure their vital signs, and I have to do that and it takes me time to walk there, and I have a tool, a technology that can measure their vital signs from outside the room, do I just get my 15 minutes back for every patient interaction? And now I have that time back in my day and nothing else has changed. Actually, no, I now don't go into the room. I now need to monitor a screen for longer periods of times. And so it's interesting to think, we often think that I have this new technology, now it just makes this part of my life better and easier and everything else stays the same, when actually the workflow and the entire activity changes. I think it'll be really interesting to see how workflows change with things like ambient scribes. I think we have this belief that like physicians will get all that time back and they'll be able to spend it with their patients and more face-to-face time. I'd be curious to see if that's the case, or what about workflows changes as new technologies get introduced. That reminded me, there's also there's some folks also who are like embracing this, and I think in an interesting way. CEO of Linear, I think it's Linear, the like Jira counter product. He has a podcast where he talks about how their tool changes workflows, and they've actually embraced it as part of sort of their like marketing and product strategy, where they're like, we're not just giving you the next software tool, we actually want to change the way that you work, and that's part of our product and part of our package. We want to like teach you a new way to work. And I think that's an interesting take. I think it's like, at a minimum, it seems helpful that he's thinking about the fact that it will change the workflow, hopefully for the good. And so I think the substitution myth to me is just the like prodding and the pushing us to think like, as we're developing new technology, do we have an awareness that it will be changing the workflows, and can we anticipate those and think about those, and what are the like positive and negative things that might come out of that? Another interesting concept that was in one of the talks, I think this is probably pretty familiar to people, maybe more so than others, but human-centered design. I think this usually comes up in like design, if you work with like designers and human-centered design. Many people, I think about it like, how do I make a web page so that it's more intuitive for the user? It more follows natural human behavior. And I think that's a part of human-centered design. But where they talked about, or where they maybe took a different angle to it, was from like building technology. And so if we build from a technology-centered design, we usually start with like, well, what can the computer or the technology do? And that, what can we automate? And then we do that. And then humans will get whatever is left over. And so if I can automate the taking of notes, or I can automate the recording of vital signs, these kind of things, great. Now what can the human do? And they challenged the idea that like the counter to that is human-centered design. So starting to think with, what are human strengths and what drive engagement? And then how do we bring technology to support that human potential? And I thought that was just an interesting shift, that like many times, because we're in technology and we're working with it, we naturally have this lens, especially the people building it, of like, what could this technology do? And we then think like, cool, then we'll figure out what happens to everybody else afterwards. And so how do we sort of reverse the order of that?
Yeah, and Caleb, I feel like that's from Nicholas Carr, right? From his
Yeah.
talk. And so I think I don't know if he said it exactly that way, but and this is, I think, definitely a fair criticism of purely tech approach to healthcare, where humans are seen as the weakest link in healthcare. And so, like, I mean, just when I look at different like investor presentations in a lot of startups, when they have a $1 billion vision for a better world, it's often about displacing like the human element in care, which is just fascinating to, I think, frame it in these two terms.
Yeah, and I think even at the best, I feel like those pitches will try to say how they're not displacing a human and how they're like trying to support the human. But I do think like the long-term vision still is like the human is the weakest link. Like let's get them out, and I think it's hard to fight that. And I think it's hard to think about like what does the human strength and engagement, what is the human flourishing that we want to see more of, and that's hard to write a business case around that. So yeah. Um, so that leads us to this idea of like, are we designing around humans? Are we designing around technology? What's progress? I think there's a really interesting framing of a question, which is, ought we? Meaning we can, but should we? So a lot of technology and businesses really start with the question of like, can we do this thing? And we usually are rate limited by, is it legal, technically feasible? Do we have budget for it? We then get to like the question of like, will it matter? We want to make sure that it has some sort of meaningful value, but mostly as it relates to that first bucket of like cost. Like we will know it has value if someone pays us for it and if it generates an ROI. And that usually is like the guiding principle of like, will we do something? It's really like, can we? And there's another question which rarely gets asked, which is should we? And that really is the rate limiter to that is values, human values. Should we develop this technology which, has a byproduct of this negative thing, or it maybe it deteriorates human society, maybe it pollutes waters, maybe it pollutes the environment. This is a much, much harder question to ask and bring to the table. I think so. Yeah, I don't know much more to add to that. It's a hard question to answer, but I think the more people asking it is a helpful thing. And then sort of the last idea on the slide is just, then what's our role in this? I think there's a couple places that we can sit, and maybe some of us sit in all of them. But the developer, the user, the advocate, I think developer thinking like, I'm writing the code, I'm working for the company. I think I see myself as like having a place in this right now. And I think there's a responsibility of seeing like, trying to anticipate where something goes and seeing like, is this where we want it to go? But at the same time, I think sometimes even technology, there's examples where no one anticipated where the invention was going to go. Actually, users shaped that a lot, and how people used it impacted the direction that it went. So we as users have a role to play in like how we use this. I mentioned this to Polyus, full disclosure, this presentation, I wrote the slides, I wrote the content, I put it all together. I'm not great at making slides. These slides were AI generated. They took my ideas and they helped make some visuals to them. And even as I was doing that, I like paused and I thought like, I am in some way contributing to the advancement of generative AI being used for media, for images, and like, I don't know if that's a good thing. So maybe I'm a little hypocritical here. I'm okay calling myself out. I think this helps me think about the question and raise the question. And but yeah, it's just like the choices. It's kind of like voting, if we think like, well, does my vote really make any difference? And I think when we think about voting, we all would say, yes, it does. Go vote. It's important. Similar in technology use, I think it can be like, well, what difference does it make if I'm using it? But I think it's like a vote, individual choices sort of matter collectively. And so it's a good challenge for me to think about how I use this. And then I think the last is just advocate, whether that's formally in like public government settings or just things like this where we're just talking about it and you're raising conversations and you're asking questions and challenging assumptions and ideas. And so I think we all sit in different parts of these roles at different extents. And so it's good to think about where we sit. I've got one more slide, which is kind of a teaser to the case study or the discussion. Yeah, the case study that we'll have. It's a set of questions, which one of the talks raised, which is like a set of questions for evaluating, thinking about a technology and where does it go. If we get to the case study, we'll actually go through these questions and we'll ask them and try to answer them about a technology, but I'll preview them here. 7 questions to evaluating technologies you're like working on and developing it. What's the problem this technology claims to be the solution to? Whose problem is it? What new problems will be created because of solving this one? Which people and institutions would be most harmed? What changes in language are being promoted? What shifts in economic and political power are likely to result? And what alternative media might be made from a technology? And I think they're a very deep set of questions to think and ask about a technology. So teaser, we'll come back to that, but now I'll just sort of pause and see, what questions, reflections people have, any objections, things I missed. We can maybe take 15 minutes or so and discuss, and would love thoughts.
And I know all of you had opinions because when you RSVP'd, I asked you about what worried you about AI. So I definitely know there's lots of smart people. So don't be shy in speaking up. Again, this is a safe space. We can totally, cut out things that people don't want to be out there on the internet. But I think Caleb really did a nice job setting up somewhat of like an ambiguous topic and gave us buckets to think through. And I mean, I think conversations like that is what pushes us forward. And actually, we're all in different positions of influence. And so if we can learn from each other, I think this is really going to be helpful. So feel free, Julie, looks like you might have something to contribute. Yeah. Go.
Yeah, thank you. Caleb, love it. Thank you. This is good stuff. I work in pharmaceutical where it's oftentimes very black and white. And so if I can't say the actual like ROI, there's push to do more technology, but everybody says AI. And so it's like this fancy term that like, when you get down to it, nobody, at least where I work, understands what it is or what it could do. And so like, it's a very confusing topic, but a lot of this resonated with what I'm currently going through at work. But one of the things you said was let's see, let me for a minute. So long-term vision is the human is the weakest link, which I thought was a really powerful statement. Because it's exactly like, right when you said that, I go, yeah, that's how I view it, right? Like I'm the weakest link and therefore this technology makes it better. But one of the things that I sent as like what's my concern with AI is the loss of the human touch. And I mean that in many different ways, right? Like physically the touch, like within healthcare, we know that makes a huge difference. We know that talking to people makes a huge difference, particularly for like mental health. So question for you is, you mentioned a podcast was talking about there are human strengths. And so how do we use technology to support those human strengths and kind of increase the potential of it? Did they give an example of a human strength that technology has amplified or kind of like, did they give a vision of what that looks like? Because I can think of, again, like physical touch, imagination, talking things through, things that you just don't get like from a digital component. I was just curious if they had an example of that.
I don't recall if they had an example in their podcast. They probably did. I think immediate things come to mind as like being well intended as doing that. I think I mentioned it like to top of mind. Generally, I think the EMR of like this place to document notes is intended for this, which is like hopefully if we could take notes that live in scratch paper and we could put them in the place, then hopefully like the human can then actually be more informed and have more meaningful conversations. They can have more context. And I think that like is a well-intended tool to say, let's help the primary care doctor or the physician or whoever have the information they need to engage with the patient in a richer way. Mm-hmm. And I think to some extent it has done that, but there's some places where maybe there was unintended. They talked about the cloning of notes, the less rich notes. There's a lot more copy and pasting. And so maybe the conversations weren't as rich. They talked about like, well, now doctors spend their time looking at a computer. And I kind of mentioned, I think ambient scribes is a similar, like a well-intentioned sort of thing. I think it thinks about, isn't the thing that we want from our providers to be able to sit and be present with our patient and not have to worry about taking notes. And so if the human strength is having that empathetic conversation and being present with them and being able to like end a day on time and go back and be with your family and be recharged, I think like those are sort of oriented around like good human values, which is like we want the patient provider interaction to be uplifted and supported, and that's the value that we're after. And so I think it's well intended. I do think that like I don't, kind of going back to the like enough and kind of like what drives it, I have questions about where does that end up going and like what stops us from just continuing that efficiency chain. And like, okay, now that if the scribe can now take the notes, what if it can ask the questions? What if it can like facilitate the interaction? Like what really preserved the like, was the physician patient interaction really the thing that we were preserving? Or like, do we move past that again and then find out that that was the weakest link again? So I don't know, but those are two examples of my mind of things where it's like, maybe it's intended to be oriented around a human value. I don't know, Paulius or others, if you have other examples that come to mind.
I'll see if others want to contribute. I can certainly add something here. And if people are not jumping at it, I'll share my take. So I think what comes to mind when you were talking about the EMR is like the friction that is created that I often deal with is it gives the false sense, like it almost pits me against the patient in some way when, especially patients that are not as tech literate, they just say, oh, it's in the computer, meaning that every computer is the same. If they said it once and somebody entered it in another computer, it's also in my computer, right? Which is like from the interoperability perspective, far from that. And it almost like creates this, like as if almost I'm not paying attention to things that I should be paying attention because their information is there. So that's certainly, yeah, a big element of friction.
Yeah, but great questions, Julie. I think, yeah, having good examples of what does it look like to do that well, I think will help inform us, like give us a model of what to work towards. Sometimes it's easy to run away from a thing, but if we don't know what does it look like to do this well, it can be hard to be oriented around it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like a matter of, right, like convincing others that, like, I love the philosophical questions and I like going down this, but if I'm being realistic, if I'm in front of a board of directors, they look like, what are you talking about? So it's like physical example or tangible examples are great. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
And Brendan, can I call on you? I think you wrote something pretty interesting about what you worried on the intake. I don't know if you're in a place where you can talk.
Yeah. No, I can talk, just video's a little hard right now.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, I can summarize what you said, or if you remember.
Sure. Go for it.
So I thought what was interesting is you said that I worry that people will misunderstand what AI is good at and bad at, and therefore I think it's a general purpose tool when it's really a series of specific tools. Can you just expand on that? I'm curious. Like that's
sure. I think the hype you hear about AI is that it can do everything and it eventually will do everything. And I don't think that's true. I think that AI is very good at very specific tasks. And so when you try and apply it to tasks that it's not good at, that's where you get confusion on the part of sort of the mismatch of capabilities and outcomes. You get sort of people using it and misapplying it. And I think a lot of the error cases come from that. I don't know. That's my general thought, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective to keep in mind. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and maybe I'll jump in with a bit of a question. I think that some of what you're framing here, you mentioned the role of the sort of technologist and the user and the advocate. Some of this feels like the role of society almost. Like, what does society as a whole reward? Does it reward efficiency, or does it reward the more, human-centered approach? And maybe you can talk a little bit about, like, maybe the society we live in values some things, but how can we influence that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think in the West, there's a common sentiment that it's like capitalist-based society, capitalist value kind of thing. I think it is interesting, and this is where, some of living around the world and being in other societies and other cultures, it is possible for cultures to have other sets of values, and I think that there are other cultures that really value more relational and reward things like loyalty or things like family, or just, I don't know necessarily. I don't have a lot of answers on here and like how does that go about, but I think you're right that there's the societal value. It feels like we're kind of moving downhill very fast, or like downhill. We're gaining momentum towards this idea of just like cost and efficiency just seems to be the only thing that we are oriented around. And so the society, I don't know. That's what I'm wrestling with and thinking through is like, what is all of our roles in shaping the society? We are the society, like the society is made up by us. And so what things do we need to do in our like small little actions that help shape that society? How do we shape our thinkings? How do we value things that seem like they don't have monetary value, but should we be convinced that like, actually, I really value personal things, and I don't like personal interactions, and I don't want to be contributing to technologies that's inherently trying to erode the need for a human to interact with another human. Like maybe that's just a value we orient around, is like humans talking things out with other humans is a good thing. So, yeah.
I can add something to that, Caleb. When you talked about like interesting family values, especially at Philippines, right, where you spend most of your life. Yeah. So I forget which Southeast Asian country this was, but there's around like a lot of the meals happen around temples in this one particular country, and there's been some research on this. I'll have to find the paper, but the idea is that when a family member gets a new diagnosis, say diabetes, it impacts diet. The entire family's diet changes. And so the illness identity is carried through like functionally through how the rest of the family interacts. So like kids in the family end up like having their curriculum changed because of the diagnosis that the family member carries. I mean, in the Western countries, I feel like we kind of add that to family history and don't really do much about it. And I just think that it's so interesting how, there are other ways of going about life out there, for sure.
That's a good example.
Al?
Yeah. So, I thought this was, your conversation and your slides were very interesting. I'm very much on, the human-centered, side of AI. And I think that if it doesn't, sort of go that way, then I think that AI is going to eventually hit a roadblock. And the reason why I say that is, just like you guys were talking about, values, I think that, the Western values, we may be, really interested in technology, really interested, in cost. But a lot of, other countries, especially developing countries, really focus on that interrelationship. So I think for AI to really expand and be, as useful as everyone is hoping it to be, I think that it really needs to sort of focus on that side, of things.
You know what? Thanks for sharing that. What this also made me think of is, like, we talk primary care all the time, and I try to gauge how people feel about primary care in people who are in different stages of their career, and I often ask, like, would you like, what's easier for you to change out your PCP or to change out your phone? If you have an iPhone, going to like an Android, which is generally a big change, and people have such relationships with their technology that it's actually, most people don't have the relationship with their primary care for like a lot of reasons. And so they're a lot more resistant to change their phone carrier, like to a different technology than to change their doctor, which is like just so fascinating to me. Uh, Brendan, you got a comment?
Sure. Let me jump in with sort of a positive example that I heard recently. So first, describing the technology, it's among the creepiest technologies I've heard coming out of AI. There's this company now that can take a short video clip of a person and then build a digital avatar of that person that can speak in their own voice. So that is extremely creepy, and you can obviously see very difficult and problematic use cases coming out of that. But apparently this technology has been used to talk to dementia patients, and the technology doesn't get tired. It doesn't get bored if the dementia patient says the same story they've said 100 times prior. And it turns out the dementia patients themselves respond really well to this because they feel like, since they're not aggravating a human being with their sort of repetition and their difficulties, they actually open up to the AI in a more authentic and genuine way because they're not, in this anxiety mental space. They're in more of a receptive mental space. And so that was actually an extremely hopeful technology coming out of something that I agree is like legitimately creepy. So I'll throw that out there.
Yeah, this is a great perspective. Mark, if I can call on you, because you take care of senior patients and hospice and senior living homes and all of that. Oh, do you have comments on that?
Absolutely. So I also saw something where AI was used to reanimate, a deceased child to help mom, cope with the separation, which was, I think I saw it on Reddit. The comments were just like all over the board, whether that's creepy or, inhumane, whether that's hurting instead of helping. I have been asking for AI generated videos for dementia patients to anyone in the space that's working with them. I think having, with consent, of course, having loved ones in the room to help redirect, because even today, I did a couple hours at a personal care home. One of the residents only listened to one aide because the aide looked like her granddaughter, right? And that's like better than any single med. You don't want to chemically sedate people with Haldol, or you don't want to physically restrain them. The state doesn't like that at all. So anything you can do that's not a pill. And you don't know how many times that once the family leaves, the resident goes AWOL. And I've heard stuff like, calling family members to have them on the phone to help redirect. Or we say stuff like, your daughter would want you to come to the dining hall. They invoke that type of authority, or that type of emotional response. So yeah, and just, sitting there too, they have nothing to look at. I always tell families, bring in photos, bring in familiar items, bring in whatever you can to make it feel like home, because that's going to prevent sundowning. It's going to prevent, behaviors. There's these nice products that they're like iPads. They circle through different photos from the family, and they actually work as like a webcam/video. Family can like spy on their loved one, and then it turns into a two-way like FaceTime device. If instead of those photos, if they could kind of make those photos kind of just 5 seconds of animation, that would be a huge thing for residents. I've heard of devices that turn the TVs into like two-way FaceTime video cameras. But yeah, instructions in like, AI avatars based on loved ones that are living, huge, even loved ones that have passed, because when a man loses his spouse, they don't do very well. Conversely, when a woman loses her husband, she does fine. I don't know why it's like that. But the guys take it, the death of their wife really, really rough. So yeah, or even famous people, a lot of people have their favorite movie or their favorite movie star from like the 60s, right? And they love watching those old movies. Can you imagine if like, Frank Sinatra could, redirect someone? They'd totally listen. It's like, oh, Frank Sinatra's talking to me. Like a lot of these people, that's what you need to like prevent a fall or a hip fracture, because people try to get up all the time, or anyways.
You're spot on that one. I'll give you two sides of that coin. You can create that, by the way, with HeyGen, really simply with a picture and audio, and you can create, it's like a 3-minute speech with the tech, and then from there, it'll automatically recreate whatever you want to say via text. So it actually works really well. Now, on the other side, I've talked to all our doctors, and they don't want to put their likeness or voice to anything because of liability issues. And so you have to use different types of AI generated imagery and then audio dub voices, and then you can do the same thing, but it won't be from a movie star or anything else. So one thing on that note also is Bruce Willis actually he was one of the first actors to license his voice and likeness to new films that are coming out with him, but obviously he can't act anymore because of his medical challenges. So it's pretty interesting. And on how we're using AI in our sector, we're a cancer screening provider. We have designed an AI agent that actually facilitates navigation for patients for appointments. So we can make thousands of calls a day to our population, get a pretty high hit rate, and then let them know that they can sign up, and they can actually click a button from the text and schedule an appointment with a real MP or doctor. So that works extremely well. And so those are some use cases that we've developed over the last few months.
That's a great segue, actually, into if there's more questions or comments. Thanks, Jonathan. I think that sounds great. Apologies, because we can transition to do a little bit of a case study, because it's actually Jonathan on that. Well, the idea of the case study is just to take these questions, pick a technology, and just kind of wrestle through the questions. So you can pick any technology. I think, Jonathan, you just brought up the one that is top of mind for me, sort of care coordination. This is the space that I work in. You could do it for ambient scribe. You could think about down the road, what if there's a PCP? But let's pick this one. Let's just spend, I know we don't have a ton of time. We can spend maybe 5 minutes. But I think it'd be interesting to ask some of these questions, maybe just the first 4. I think those are probably the ones that I resonate the most with. But imagine you had that, Jonathan, you had that service, you had a care coordinator I would say / nurse educator. Again, this is let's ask these questions, not how will it work? Will it be successful? How might it fail the patient from operations? Let's assume that it works. Let's assume that it provides patient education. It can do FAQs. It can manage appointments, can triage and coordinate care needs. Assume that it works. It's less of how or why it won't work, but more, and then assume that there's also widespread adoption. Let's say you now really don't have the role of nurse educator or care coordinator. I'm curious, if we as a group answer these questions, what's the problem that technology is sort of aiming to solve? And open to thoughts, or you could really pick any 4 of these. We can go in order, but if you want to chime in on any of them, curious, if that existed in full-fledged, what problem is that trying to solve?
Staffing levels obviously is one of the biggest ones for most health systems.
And is that good? Is
the
that
ability to actually outreach with enough patients in real time every single month to ensure that their wellness visits are actually attained? Because right now they're not in most cases, and more so on the preventative side as well.
So Caleb, I think the most interesting question to me on here is actually what new problems will be created because of solving this one, right? Because for that thing to exist, it solves a business problem and stuff. Jonathan, what do you think is going to be the new problem that what you're doing is going to create?
Oh, there's guarantee there's one very obvious answer. It's called AI assurance or quality assurance. Most of our facilities that we work, by the way, we work with federally qualified health centers predominantly, and health systems for that matter, but mostly FQHCs. They do not even have a governance board or legal even figured out yet for this. So it's very tough to go in and buy or vet something if you don't even know legally can you do it. And so they're years behind, and almost every health system in the country is years behind on clinical navigation or diagnostics using clinical AI because of the fear of retribution, getting lawsuits, malpractice, et cetera. And so they haven't even had, for example, these boards they manage every month, they haven't even had a discussion around AI yet to actually put it on paper to figure out even how to deal with it. So they're far behind. I would say that's number one by far. So quality assurance, AI assurance, making sure whatever you do or say with AI is ethical, and helping patients from an outcome perspective.
And what about, I think, Paul, you're right. That question is really interesting. What about the last one as well? Do you have a perspective on what people or institutions might be harmed? Like if we imagine that world in which AI is now doing everything I've described above, like do you have perspectives on who people, institutions, think about jobs, think about interactions, like who might be harmed as a result of that?
Oh, you're speaking to me. I mean, fallacy, this is not really true, but there's only like 30,000 radiologists in the country. And unfortunately, there's not enough doctors to actually offer preventative services at scale anywhere. So I would say that there's always a joke with our radiology partners that AI will replace us one day. It's obviously a compliment, but there's that fear that eventually AI is going to get so good, it will replace people, as it's doing in other fields like engineering right now. And if you're in Silicon Valley where I am, you can see that if you're not a very high-end engineer, you're not finding jobs right now. It's really tough.
So is your perspective that's the equivalent group that's the group of people that might be harmed, or?
I would say so. And navigation. So lower level like MAs and others that don't have licensing yet or credentials would be potentially affected as well, because those are the most easiest form of job replacement. So anything clinical, administrative, workflow, navigation.
Thank you, Jonathan. Mark, you had a comment, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of minutes remaining. So Mark.
I'd love to hear people's, maybe they can comment. If I was getting a full body MRI or any type of CT scan, MRI brain or mammogram, I'd prefer to have like an AI radiology. I'd prefer the AI radiologist over a human radiologist, because if I don't know the radiologist personally and I don't know the quality of their reads, like if you ever sit down or like watch a radiologist read, like number one, they hate reading MRIs of the brain. They just absolutely hate it. They hate reading mammograms. That's their number one hatred is mammograms, because the stakes are so high. Like, you're condemning people to biopsies and overreads or underreads, et cetera. And I know I was with a radiology team and they just leave the MRI brains at the top of the queue and they leave the mammograms at the top of the queue, and nobody wanted to take them. And, some of the radiologists are amazing, but if I don't know the system, and I've had so many these mobile reads these mobile x-rays that I order, literally we're talking about missing fractures and stuff like that. Obvious ankle fractures. I'd rely more on a radiology AI tool versus a human. It's at that point because I'm using AI so much and I see holy crap, this is unbelievable.
Exactly.
Ideally both, but if I'm getting especially a full body MRI where there's probably hundreds of thousands of little pixels that are relevant, I want that AI tool instead of that human.
Exactly. And I apologize, I have to sneak off in 2 minutes, but I want to say one thing about that. So out of the 11,000 CPT codes that are available today for encounter-based fee-for-service models, there's only 500 of these that actually are AI specific for diagnostics. And out of those, only 16 of those are reimbursable. And so that's the fallacy of clinical AI, is it's not being utilized. Even though 16, the claims are all sub 1,000, meaning over the last 7 years, no one's ever used them. And there is actually a document I'll probably post later. I'll give it to Paulius to post. It's a 7 or 8 page PDF, basically walking through this entire process of why AI is not being used. But it's really bad. But you're right. It needs to be a complement. It has to be both, because there's a 20 to 30% error rate for diagnostics from a radiologist perspective, when they're doing a 500 scan read or 500 slice read, there's mistakes all the time. And if I'm not going to put my life on the line from some random doctor that may be tired one day, because you have no way to know who's doing it as a patient. So yeah, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
So that's a transparency issue that we don't have today in America, and it's pretty deplorable.
That's really interesting to hear, Jonathan. Yeah, send that over. I'd be happy to distribute. And I would just say thanks, Caleb, for like guiding us through the thoughtful reflection on human values and technology. This has been great, and others, thanks really for contributing and coming to be part of this. And we'll continue the conversation on Slacks and stuff. So see you out there. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.